Hello everybody. I now welcome you all to the next yet a unique journey. One not only across time and space, but also across the moral landscape that now unfolds beyond Earth's blue horizon. Today we enter a realm where law meets science, where philosophy finds relevance in zero gravity, and where the human pursuit of survival and knowledge faces its most profound ethical dilemmas. Our discussion centers on the intricate ethical and legal considerations surrounding human spaceflight, space colonization, and bioethics in the context of an increasingly extraterrestrial future. As humanity expands its gaze and ambitions beyond our home planet, we find ourselves at a transformative juncture. The 20th century was marked by the awe of the first satellite and the first moonwalk. But the 21st century is heralding an era of far greater complexity. One defined not only by exploration but by occupation. From manned missions to Mars, to construction of commercial space stations, to serious proposals for permanent off-Earth colonies. The nature of our engagement with outer space has fundamentally changed. This shift introduces ethical questions of unprecedented scope. What rights do astronauts retain in extreme and isolated environments? How do we ensure the mental health and informed consent of spacefarers? What framework governs space colonies? Do they obey Earth's laws or evolve their own? And at a deeper level, do celestial bodies possess intrinsic value, or are they mere instruments of human exploitation? How adequately examine these issues, one must first appreciate that the legal scaffolding surrounding space activities is both relatively young and conspicuously thin. The foundational document in international space law, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, was a visionary step, but it was born in the era of state-centric exploration, far removed from today's privatized, profit-driven space race. The treaty rightly prohibits national appropriation of celestial bodies and mandates peaceful uses of outer space. However, it takes little about human rights in space ethical governance of colonies, or the bioethical implications of modifying human beings for survival in other worlds. Furthermore, while treaties such as the Moon Agreement attempted to address the equitable sharing of resources from celestial bodies, they failed to garner support from major spacefaring nations. As a result, we are now entering a phase where international law remains largely silent on many critical moral questions that will define the next century of space engagement. And this is precisely where ethics must step in. Not to replace the law, but to guide its evolution. The need for a robust ethical framework is especially urgent given the rise of private anchors in the space domain. SpaceX, Blue Origin, and Virgin Galactic are no longer future projects. They are operational enterprises, launching satellites, space tourists, and soon long-duration human missions. These developments blur the lines between public and private accountability, between national jurisdiction and corporate autonomy. A law student studying this field must ask, who governs when multiple stakeholders with the conflicting interest operate beyond Earth? How do we reconcile the profit motive with the principles of justice, equity, and human dignity? In parallel, Scientific advances in medicine, genetic engineering, and artificial intelligence are converging with space exploration in transformative ways. Consider this: the human body is not designed to live in space. Our muscles autotrophy or our bones weaken, our immune systems falter, and our mental states suffer under isolation and sensory deprivation. To address these issues, scientists are now considering unprecedented measures, genetic modifications, cybernetic enhancements, and AI-assisted bodily regulation. These raise deep bioethical questions. What continues informed consent when risks are poorly understood? Should we engineer future humans for space living? And most importantly, what rights do these augmented individuals retain under the law? Moreover, the establishment of space colonies possess one of the most intriguing questions of political philosophy and legal theory. How do you create an order in a space with no precedent, no borders, no history? Will Martian colonies be extensions of terrestrial nation states, or will they develop their own autonomous governance models? Do Earth-based constitutions extend into space, or does a new form of constitutionalism emerge? As we delve deeper into these questions over the course of this lecture, I urge you to keep two central themes in mind: human dignity and intergenerational justice. Human dignity forms the core of nearly every international human rights instrument, from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to ICCPR, the regional charters. It demands that we treat every human being regardless of their location in the universe as ends in themselves and not merely as means to some cosmic or commercial objective. Intergenerational justice reminds us that our actions today, whether it be exploiting asteroids or terraforming Mars, have profound consequences for future generations who will inherit the cosmos we shape. The legal scholar of tomorrow will not only be the interpreter of treaties or statutes, but will be required to engage with emerging frontiers of ethical reasoning. They must understand the consent in contexts where no legal precedent exists. They must grapple with sovereignty in environments devoid of traditional territoriality. They must debate the moral status of artificial intelligence embedded in mission-critical operations. And they must be prepared to legislate for environments that are quite literally otherworldly. We are not simply extending Earth's civilization into space. We are reimagining civilization itself. As law students, it's your task to ask the right questions now, while humanity still has the chance to lay down the first principles rather than play catch up after the fact. Should space be treated as a global commons or as a realm of proprietary conquest? Should we allow children to be born in orbit, and if so, who protects their rights? What kind of legal personhood do we grant to cyborg astronauts or AI mission leaders? These are no longer speculative questions. They are fast becoming practical necessities. As such, this lecture series is designed not to inform but provoke critical thought. To that end, our upcoming sections will each tackle a specific domain of space ethics. Human spaceflight, where we'll address autonomy, risk, medical consent, and psychological well-being. The space colonization and governance, exploring constitutional models, human rights, and political autonomy in extraterrestrial settings will be our other topic. Now, coming to the next one, I want you all to understand the AI-human integration. Environmental ethics in cosmos, that's questioning our right to terraform or exploit planets and debating whether non-Earth entities have intrinsic value. Commercial and militaristic exploitation, contrasting the ambitions of private billionaires and national military powers with our shared ethical responsibilities. Legal gaps and reform proposals, where we discuss the future of space law and potential frameworks for just a cosmic order. In conclusion, I invite you to approach these sessions not just as student of law, but as a future architects of just interplanetary society. Let us remember, space is not merely a destination. It is a mirror, one that reflects our values, amplifies our decisions, and magnifies both our triumphs and our failures. What do we choose to carry with us into the stars? Our ethics, our laws, our humanity will ultimately determine whether we build a future worth inhabiting. Coming to another section, which will be human spaceflights and bioethics. Now, I wish you all, having laid the conceptual groundwork in our previous topic, we now move to the heart of our discussion, the ethical and legal dimensions of human spaceflight, where science, policy, bioethics, and the law intersect in profoundly complex ways. Human spaceflight is no longer confined to government astronauts and Cold War rivalry. It has evolved into a dynamic and increasingly privatized endeavor featuring commercial space tourism, international collaboration, and emerging aspirations for long-duration missions and eventual colonization. While the advancement of technology has enabled these ambitions, it has also magnified the ethical risks and legal uncertainties associated with sending human beings into one of the most hostile environments ever encountered. Let us understand by exploring one of the foundational principles in medical ethics, autonomy, and how it translates or at times fails to translate into the context of outer space. Autonomy and informed consent in spaceflight is our topic. On Earth, informed consent is not a non-negotiable principle of medical and legal practice. It requires that individuals understand the nature of the procedure, its risks and benefits, and agree to it voluntarily without coercion. But in space, the concept of voluntarily informed consent becomes murky. When astronauts embark on missions, particularly those of long duration, such as a proposed Mars mission or lunar-based assignment, they enter a scenario where risks are numerous, unpredictable, and sometimes beyond even scientific understanding. Consider exposure to high-energy cosmic radiation and psychological consequences of extreme isolation or potential for mechanical or biological failure with fatal outcomes. Can any person genuinely consent to such an experience when the full scope of risk is unknown or incalculable? Further complicating this issue is operational hierarchy. On the International Space Station, astronauts must follow mission protocols dictated by their space agencies, often overriding individual preference in emergency situations. A crew member who refuses for any medical procedure, for instance, may risk the endangering the whole mission. Does autonomy hold firm in such high-stakes cooperative environments? Or is it inherently limited by collective nature of space survival? In legal terms, this resembles a tension between individual rights and communal responsibility. On Earth, legal systems even favor autonomy unless the person's decisions endangers others. In space, however, the standard shifts much more aggressively towards group preservation. This raises important jurisprudential questions about whether the astronaut is agreeing into a mission tactically waives certain rights of refusal. This contractual waiver approach, while efficient, sits uncomfortably against modern doctrines of bodily integrity and informed consent. Let us now consider a hypothetical situation. Suppose an astronaut on a 3-year mission to Mars begins to experience severe psychological breakdown and refuses all medication or treatment. The crew physician insists on a sedative injection authorized by Earth Command. Is this lawful? Is this ethical? And most importantly, under which jurisdiction is this decision evaluated? At present, jurisdiction aboard international spacecraft is determined by the nationality of the module or craft per Article 8 of the Outer Space Treaty. This could mean, for example, that an American astronaut in a Russian module may be subject to Russian law. But in multinational missions or future space colonies, this model becomes impractical, leading to regulatory chaos. Thus, space bioethics must address not only clinical questions but also jurisdictional clarity. It must ask, who has legal authority in orbit? Is there a universal code of space medical ethics? How do we resolve conflicts between Earth-based commands, structures on-site, medical judgment? These questions highlight the urgent need for an internationally harmonized space medical code of conduct, similar to the Declaration of Helsinki or Belmont Report, but tailored for extraterrestrial conditions. Law students and future policy makers must advocate for such standards before private missions push ahead with unregulated protocols. Coming to the next topic, that is isolation, confinement and right to mental health. Let us explore the profound psychological and ethical consequences of isolation and confinement, conditions that are unavoidable in space missions, and research conducted through analog missions such as Mars 500 project, the HERA program and the polar expeditions that show prolonged confinement and sensory monotony can lead to anxiety, depression, cognitive decline and in some cases psychosis. The right to mental health, long recognized in international law under instruments like ICE-SCR Article 12, becomes both a moral obligation and a legal challenge in space environments. But how can this be meaningfully upheld? Unlike on Earth, where therapy, medication, or even relocation are options, astronauts have extremely limited access to mental health services. Telemedicine, where useful, is constrained by time delays, especially in interplanetary missions. For Mars, signal delays can range from 5 to 20 minutes each way, rendering real-time psychological counseling impossible. This raises a chilling possibility that astronauts might suffer prolonged mental trauma with minimal recourse or relief, and that mission agencies may lack adequate protocols to intervene. In law, this would likely constitute a breach of duty of care, yet the absence of enforceable standards in spacemakers litigation virtually impossible. What would be an ethical solution look like? It would require mandatory mental health screening before, during and after missions, the inclusion of mental health officers in crew selection, and most importantly, the autonomy respecting protocols for psychological treatment. Consent must remain paramount, even when a person is mentally vulnerable. Otherwise, we risk the repeating of dark histories of coercive psychiatric practices now condemned in modern medicine. A future complication arises in future long-term space habitats, such as lunar bases or Martian cities, where generations may be born and raised. In such settings, prolonged isolation becomes not only just a mission phase but a way of life. Lawmakers must therefore consider the cumulative intergenerational effects of isolation, not only on mental health but on identity formation, cultural continuity and social justice. Coming to medical ethics and emergency interventions, I am going to talk about medical ethics. Medical care in space presents a series of ethical quandaries that strain the limits of existing bioethical and legal paradigms. When emergencies occur, and they will, standard Earth-based procedures are often impossible to apply. In space, there may be no hospitals, no specialties, and no possible of evacuation. Surgery must be performed in zero gravity, with limited tools and sterile conditions. Blood does not behave the same way in the microgravity, and even something as simple as vomiting can become life-threatening. Under such conditions, the triage principle becomes paramount. Resources are rationed, and not everyone may receive optimal care. Here we confront the uncomfortable yet necessary debate about allocative justice in extreme environments. Should priority be given to the most vital crew member, the pilot, or the engineer, the commander? What if an older astronaut falls ill during a Mars mission and cannot recover? Does the crew have the right to withdraw the treatment? Is euthanasia permissible? These questions call for clarity in the mission contracts and space health policy. But more importantly, they demand ethical foresight. Future lawyers working with space agencies must consider how to draft enforceable yet compassionate protocols for medical ethics in space. This includes defining medical negligence in a zero-gravity context, clarifying standards of care expectations, and setting out legal remedies or their substitutes in case of failure. Coming to the next topic, jurisdiction, consent, and legal liability. We now return to the key legal theme, jurisdiction. To examine how liability and consent are framed in space missions, under the Treaty of Outer Space, launching states are internationally liable for damage caused by their space objects, that is Article 7. However, when it comes to the individual harm, such as medical malpractice, psychological injury, or coercive treatment, the legal terrain is far less certain. There are no established courts, no transnational medicine boards, and no supranational regulators in space. This legal vacuum creates ambiguity in tort law, contract law, and human rights law. Furthermore, consent in space is often presumed to be total. Astronauts sign comprehensive waivers, agreeing to assume all missions-related risk. But under Earth-based jurisprudence, courts have repeatedly found that waivers do not gross negligence, coercion, or non-disclosure. Could these principles apply in space? If an astronaut sues for psychological trauma or medical neglect, which law applies? US law, Russian law, or Martian constitutional law? The field of space tort law is in its infancy, and legal education must evolve to prepare the students for such complexities. Law schools and international bodies should begin considering model laws and treaties for interplanetary civil liability, crew member rights, and ethical dispute resolution mechanisms. Now, coming to genetic engineering and bioenhancement in space, we would like to talk about genetic engineering. The prolonged exposure to radiation, microgravity, and isolation in space poses a severe threat to human psychology and physiology. To mitigate these effects, researchers have begun exploring the possibility of genetically modifying humans to better survive off Earth environments. These controversial propositions sit at the intersect of cutting-edge science and fraught ethical terrain. Unlike medical treatment aimed at curing diseases, genetic enhancement involves altering the human genome to improve or adapt certain traits such as increasing radiation resistance, bone density, or cognitive function prior to or during space missions. In terrestrial bioethics, this practice already raises moral concerns about equity, consent, and the definition of humanity itself. When transposed into space, these concerns are amplified. From a legal standpoint, there is no clear international framework regulations and genetic modification of astronauts. The Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights 2005, while emphasizing dignity and need for consent in human experimentation, is not legally binding and offers no space-specific provisions. Meanwhile, national laws vary. For example, the United States permits certain gene editing research under ethical review, whereas many European countries impose stricter bans. A pressing question is this: can a space agency mandate genetic enhancement as a precondition for participation in long-duration space missions? Such a mandate would likely violate current norms of bodily autonomy and informed consent, yet mission planners may argue that it is necessary to ensure survival and mission success. Thus, sets the stage for a potential legal collision between collective necessity and individual rights. If enhancement becomes essential for space survival, the distinction between voluntarily choice and coercion begins to blur. Furthermore, enhancements may create biological hierarchies within crews, where modified individuals are privileged over natural humans, resulting in new forms of discrimination that the law has never encountered. More troubling still is the possibility that future generations of spaceborne humans may be genetically engineered in vitro or even selectively bred to better adapt to life on other planets. This brings us to our next critical theme: the ethical and legal status of future persons. Yet, we'll continue with consent and the rights of future generations. When decisions made today irrevocably affect future lives, ethics demands that we take into account the principle of intergenerational justice. This principle invokes in environmental law and also applies to space colonization and bioethics, making us learn about consent and rights. Let's suppose a child is born in a Martian colony and exhibits developmental disorders linked to low gravity and elevated radiation. That child did not choose to be born in such a hazardous environment, nor could they have consented to any prior genetic enhancements their parents authorized. Is this morally justifiable? Bioethical doctrine typically protects against what is known as non-identity problem, where future individuals, through harmed by a decision, owe their very existence to that decision. However, from a legal standpoint, especially in tort law, wrongful life claims may arise when children are born into unforeseeable sufferings due to parental or institutional choices. Wherever such claims could be heard in space courts or what jurisdiction would hear them is currently unanswered. Furthermore, ethical guidelines must be developed to regulate procreation in space. Should reproduction be allowed on long-duration missions? What rights do unborn spaceborne humans possess? Does the Convention on the Rights of the Child extend to lunar habitats or Martian settlements? There is also a pressing need for legislative foresight. While earth-bound constitutions and human rights charters assume terrestrial biology and context, none account for a future where children may grow up in an entirely artificial ecosystem, with altered genetics, limited freedoms, and new definitions of kinship and community. Lawmakers and legal scholars must begin developing space-adapted human rights frameworks, ensuring that even the most novel forms of life enjoy dignity and legal protection. Coming to the next topic, that is human-machine integration and neuroethics in space. Another frontier in space bioethics involves the integration of human beings with artificial intelligence and robotics, a trend that is gaining momentum in both terrestrial medicine and aerospace design. Brain-computer interfaces, neural implants, and AI-mediated decision systems are being tested to enhance human condition, regulation mode, and control spacecraft functions. These innovations are not only transformative but also deeply destabilizing to established legal norms. First, the issue of autonomy is complicated when decision-making becomes hybridized, shared between biological and artificial systems. For example, if a crew member's neural implant is designed to override emotional instability or panic during emergencies, are they still acting with free will? Can a person be held legally responsible for decisions partially dictated by AI algorithms or implants? Second, the concept of legal personhood may need redefinition. Should enhanced humans, those whose brains or bodies are partially machine, be treated differently in law? Do they possess new vulnerabilities or capabilities that necessitate update legal protections? And if AI entitles within these themes exhibit a degree of independent agencies, what is their status in law? Tools, co-agents, or sentient beings? Third, privacy and surveillance become major ethical concerns. Wearable and embedded technology aboard spacecraft may constantly monitor crew members. vitals, thoughts, emotions, or even dreams. While useful for ensuring safety and mental health, such surveillance borders on biometric authoritarianism if not regulated properly. Laws must ensure that astronauts retain informal privacy. Even in environments where absolute transparency may be considered operational and beneficial, this must be kept. The field of neuroethics in space is still nascent but must be quickly developed to keep the pace with emerging technologies. Legal education in space law must now include neurocognitive jurisprudence, AI law, and moral philosophy of sentient-machine relations. Topics once considered science fiction now are fast becoming urgent legal realities. If I talk about the legal reflection to conclude this comprehensive examination of human spaceflight and bioethics, we must all return to our core questions. What are the limits of human adaptation? What rights must remain non-negotiable, even in space? And how must the legal frameworks evolve to preserve human dignity in environments so alien, so hostile, and so full of both danger and possibility? It is clear that existing international space law is insufficient to govern the full range of ethical dilemmas posed by human spaceflight. While the Outer Space Treaty provides a foundational framework, it was never designed to address genetic engineering, neural implants, reproductive rights, or long-term isolation. Thus, a new generation of biolegal instrument is required, developed through international consensus, rooted in human rights, and adaptable to future context. We must also embrace a pluralistic ethical approach, recognizing that no single doctrine, be it utilitarianism, deontology, or virtue ethics, can alone answer the questions of space presents. Instead, we must synthesize diverse perspectives drawing from medicine, law, philosophy, anthropology, and systems engineering. Above all, the law must not be trail behind technology. It must lead it. It must articulate the conditions under which technological advancements is just and equitable and humane. And it must ensure that the same values we cherish on earth, liberty, dignity, consent, and justice, do not evaporate in the vacuum of space. Let us therefore not merely prepare for space, we must ethically govern it, because the choices we make now at the dawn of our cosmic journey will shape the future of law, life, and liberty of stars. Now, I will see you in the next segment. Till then, take care and keep learning.